Hello everyone, my name is Devansh and welcome to the 10th session of SillyHacks. Now allow me to introduce SillyHacks to you. SillyHacks is a 48-hour long workshop starting on 18th of September. Now it is an online global hackathon, so anyone from any part of the world can join, and we already have people from 50 plus countries. And it is a hackathon where you have to hack for fun. Here we are not looking for anyone to solve any serious problems. It is just so that you can connect with people and have fun while you are hacking. So we are just trying to build that kind of a hackathon where you can have fun and bringing back all the fun there is in a hackathon. Now, talking about today's session, we have Daniel Phiri with us. Now, he is a DJ who likes to drink coffee. He's working at Strappy and he figured out that he had a strong calling to share whatever knowledge he gains. So let us welcome Daniel.
Hey everybody, I am Daniel. Thanks for joining the session and coming to learn GraphQL. Thanks for the introduction, Devansh. Like Devansh said, I really enjoy my coffee and I'm excited to be sharing GraphQL with everyone today.
Sure, just let me know whenever you are ready so that we can get ahead with the session.
All right, yeah, I'm pretty ready. I see Pranshu and Hashu in the comments. Nice to see you all. All right, I'll just start by sharing my screen.
Yeah.
So I like quite a bad habit, but I switch between screens quite a bit. So yeah, let's go. I really love the SillyHacks logo. Devansh is the one who
Thank you for
conceptualized
that
it.
one.
I just learned. So yeah, let's get started.
Sure. So your screen is visible and I'll just drop off. I'm sorry. I'll just drop off.
All right, no problem. Ready when everyone is. Great. So GraphQL 101. This is a very beginner-friendly session into what GraphQL is, how to use it, and how to integrate it into web applications. I will be switching through a couple of things, but before we get started, like Devansh said, my name is Daniel Phiri, and you can find me anywhere online as Malgambes. I do developer relations at Strappy, a really cool headless CMS, which I will be showing everyone today. And I'm a disc jockey on Mixcloud. So if you like techno or deep house, you should check me out. Cool. So everything I will be talking about in the workshop today, everything we'll be covering is in a Notion page. And if you want to run through the Notion page, you can use this address to get access to it so that you have context and you can have an idea of everything we'll be covering. It looks really nice, and that's exactly what I'll be using to actually give the workshop. So bit.ly slash GraphQL 10101. And yeah, you have access to everything from there. I'll just leave this on the screen. And yeah, I see good vibes in the comments. Exactly. Lots of good vibes on the Sunday. Yeah, cool. Let's go ahead. I think the link's on the screen for anyone who wants that. And I'll start by giving everyone an overview of of what we'll be doing today. We're going through what is GraphQL and going through a few definitions and explanations. We'll be looking at GraphQL types and operations. And then we'll be looking, at setting up a GraphQL API with Strappy. Then we'll be making queries, mutations, understanding GraphQL tooling, and then how to use GraphQL in a web application. In case anyone in the hackathon actually wants to use GraphQL for their hacks. And then we'll be looking at resources and more learning for any future learning you might have, or any resources that I think are really important in your GraphQL journey. Everything will be detailed there. Great. I guess we can begin now. We're sort of done with the slides now. I'll be switching to the Notion. Just take that away. Great. So GraphQL 101. If you want access to this board, by the way, the link is bit.ly/GraphQL 10101. There it is on the screen. And just a few disclaimers or points of notification or notes. It's a workshop that will get you up to scratch with GraphQL, which is a query language for APIs. And like I mentioned, I hope you understand its use cases, its history, and how to use data from a GraphQL API in the front end of your web application. So this is very beginner friendly. Don't worry about that. If you have no idea what GraphQL is, that's the point of this workshop. And by the end of it, you should have an idea of what GraphQL is and how you can use it. We'll start out by looking at exactly what GraphQL is. I have a very, I'll highlight it here. So GraphQL is an open source data query and manipulation language for APIs. What that means is it gives us access to data and gives us special ways of manipulating and querying being getting that data and doing whatever we want with it. And to properly understand what GraphQL is, we have to look at what an API is. So API is short for Application Programming Interface. And this really just helps computers interact with each other in different ways. So how do computers interact? We send data to each other. So a GraphQL API is really just one of the newer ways of sending data from one computing interface to another computing interface, or multiple computing interfaces. A brief history of computing interfaces or APIs is we've had something called SOAP, which is Simple Object Access Protocol. If you go to your bank, most banks, very traditional banks, and ask them what they're using, most are using SOAP APIs. And then the ubiquitous REST APIs, representational state transfer, which uses HTTP requests, that these being get, post, options, update, and a few others. And this has been the standard, REST has been the standard for quite a long time. And its nature really brought about the necessity, or like brought about why we needed GraphQL. REST APIs had a standard format that followed a certain syntax, and it gave you REST APIs gave you access to resources. So if you were querying a REST API, this is how your URL would look. So it would look something like my website slash my website.com, of course, because this is on the internet, slash probably a version 1 of your API. And then we have let's say your website has your speaking opportunities. So that is one endpoint. And you'd only be able to access your speaking opportunities by making a request to this resource on the internet. And if you wanted to have access to all your blog posts, you would have to query another endpoint for your blog posts. So something like that, blog posts. And by design, as things scale, of course, this becomes very cumbersome. Because when you make requests to such an endpoint, you get back a JSON being JavaScript object notation, get back a JSON object which defines items from this endpoint. So if it's speaking opportunities, if we make a query to this endpoint, we'd get something like the conference name, the attendee the attendance, how many people came. Would get things like the location of the event, would get things like the name of your your session, and sometimes we didn't need all this data. And that's like some of these things are exactly what GraphQL fixes. And right now we'll just be diving through the theory of everything and getting to understand why it exists before we actually see how to use GraphQL, and then a lot of this will make a lot of sense. So that's an overview of what protocols we used to interact with computers, computing interfaces. REST really was the standard for a long time. It still is the standard. And just to put it out there, GraphQL isn't there to um, do away with REST. It's there to complement it and be used in use cases where REST doesn't make sense. So what did GraphQL come with? GraphQL came with a few solutions to problems that REST had. So with REST, we had a problem of overfetching whenever we wanted a resource. So we had that speaking endpoint that I talked about. Whenever we had that and we made a request there, we sometimes got back data that we didn't want. Maybe we just want to display um, our like the session name and the location. Uh, Beside, like regardless of that, we would get everything from that endpoint. And over the internet, this is a transfer of data and it has a certain bandwidth. And that is a very heavy payload to get back data that you don't need. So most times with REST APIs, you'd see that you get back data that you don't necessarily need. And that is something that we call overfetching. Let me just have a sip of. All right, thank you. Yeah, and that is something that we called overfetching. And with GraphQL, and you'll see this later on, we ask for exactly what we need and we get just that. And that is a huge solution because then the payload size of your response is greatly reduced and it makes for much faster requests. And I think you saw, as I mentioned, when I was explaining different APIs and different endpoints, sorry, we can have a speaking endpoint and we can have a blogs endpoint and the list goes on. We can have a favorite songs, favorite movies, and this really is just an overload of endpoints. And with bigger systems, as we scale our applications, we have this sea of endpoints, which, if not properly documented, and even if properly documented, can be hard to like realize what like which endpoint has exactly like where's the data we need, what endpoint has the data we need. And this endpoint overload was a huge problem because besides just having multiple endpoints, when you versioned an API, when you went from version 1 to version 2 to version 3 and you didn't deprecate, that means like do away with the other endpoints, we still had 3 versions of, let's say, 50 endpoints. And that was a huge problem. With GraphQL, this is much easier because you have access to every single data item in your data store or your data warehouse. And all this is accessible through a single resource. So you only have a single endpoint for your whole API. If I want to get my blogs, if I want to get my speaking opportunities and make requests to this endpoint, I only have to make a request to a single endpoint. And that is a huge advantage of GraphQL. We also have type safety. If you look at the what we'll be covering today, we talk about types. GraphQL is typed by default. Oops. Let's go back here. Sorry about that. GraphQL is typed by default. So you know exactly what data you're requesting and what type it has. And then that makes it much easier to avoid errors. We have a lot of errors and we're seeing the sort of rise of languages like TypeScript that are strongly typed and advocate for type safety. And GraphQL out of the box supports this because every resource that you request in a GraphQL API has a type and that is specified in building this. Yeah, and that's a bit of what GraphQL brings to the table and the problems it solves. How did it come up? One of the biggest websites in the world, undoubtedly the most used, I guess, besides Google, don't quote me on that, is Facebook. And if you look at how Facebook is structured, it has a lot of data in a very small space. And I think a lot of these issues that I mentioned start to come up because if you think about how Facebook is structured, when you go to your homepage, you have a bar on the right where you have all the groups that you are a member of. You have your main newsfeed. Um, you have your birthdays, and you have your friend suggestions, and all these sections are powered by endpoints. And a lot of times we have to make requests for data that isn't necessarily necessary. And the engineers at Facebook noticed this problem as they were moving from native development, being primarily on the web, to having something that's native for mobile users, because that's at the time where mobile was becoming a big thing. And developing a UI that would be efficient and robust and not have the problems of the web brought over to native development was a huge problem for them. And that's sort of how GraphQL was developed as a solution for Facebook to be as performant as possible on different UIs. And it came with all these solutions, like I mentioned, a single endpoint, so no endpoint overload, no overfetching. So you got exactly what you wanted. And that made it really efficient for people on mobile devices. Yeah, and that's sort of the inception of GraphQL. And today we have so many GraphQL adopters. Facebook, of course, still uses GraphQL. If if you've tweaked around with the GitHub API for some time, you notice that GitHub uses GraphQL. Um, the shows you binge on the weekend, Netflix uses GraphQL, and StockX, which is a sort of retailer online marketplace for, I don't know if I can call them luxury shoewear, or yeah, and a lot of street style wear also uses GraphQL. So GraphQL really is really useful with large data sets where you only want to get exactly what you need. And yeah, that's really just context on what GraphQL is, what problems GraphQL solves, and how it came up, and how you can use it, and who's currently using it. So I've sort of structured this as a what I wish I knew when I was getting started with GraphQL. It's it's about September 2020, and I've been using GraphQL now for about 2 years. Um, it's something that I've been using and playing around with. So I thought this would be a really good idea to just get everyone up to scratch and share what I wish I knew about GraphQL when I was getting into it. Cool. Also, if you have any questions, just feel free to add them to the chat, and I will try and get by them. Okay, so that's it with what is GraphQL. Now we can go through GraphQL types and operations. And very soon we'll be getting into actually using GraphQL. Great. So types and fields. I'm trying to think of an analogy for types that would make sense here. If anyone has used languages, programming languages like C or C++ or Java, I think we're very aware of things like booleans and var, not var, very JavaScript, things like boolean and strings and characters. And at the base of GraphQL really are types and fields. So types really just define a definition of a sort of distinction, how you would describe your resource or your data. And each type has a field, which then has a description of what that field has stored in it. So then I like to give this example of a type called query, which has a location property that is of type country. So type country is also defined by something. We have a type called country, which has these fields in it: ID, string, and capital. So the type of the string field is a string. I mean, of the name field is a string, and the type of a capital field is a string too. So at the base of GraphQL really is types and fields. So fields, a bunch of fields make up a type, and every type is described by the fields it contains. And this really is where you start to see the strongly typed nature of GraphQL. So you know that the name field in the type country will always have a format of string. And so we can replace string with values like Boolean or number or float and things like that. So at the base of GraphQL, like I mentioned, are types and fields, where types are described by the fields that they contain. So if we have a type country, if we look at what describes a country, how would we want to recognize a country, or what would we use to look at to describe a country? We, of course, would say maybe a country has an ID, a unique identifier that we can use to identify this country. We have a name that is of type string. Every country, of course, has a name, and every country has a capital city. And this is really how we describe data in GraphQL. So having this description of this data, if we want to sort of query and get data from a resource that has this description, this is what our query format would look like. So we have the location as a field. So we want to query a location. And in querying our location, we know that we'll get back a country, a country type. And we have a description of our country type, and we know what fields are inside our country type. And we can get back exactly what we want. So let's say we want to skip out on the ID. So we get a name field and a capital field from the country type. And then when we make this request, we get back a JSON object that looks like this. So we have our location, we have our country name, which is Zambia, capital, Lusaka. And that is the format of GraphQL. So it's sort of building from the description of your service, where we have a query type, and inside that query type, we have a location. That location returns a country. However, this country type is also defined by the fields in it. So we have a country type, which is defined by a name and a capital. So whenever we make a country to a location type, we get back a country type. But in our country type, we need to describe exactly what we want to get out of our country type. What fields do we want out of our country type? And that's why we make this specification that we want the name and the capital fields. So this is really how GraphQL you describe exactly what you want, and you get exactly that back, which is visible in the JSON object we get back as a response from this query request. Great. I'll just check if there's any questions. So building on the types and fields that we just described that are sort of at the base of GraphQL, we'll tackle the next concept, which is the schema. A schema is like a dictionary for your service. So whenever we are requesting data from a service or an API, we use these two terms interchangeably, service and API. So whenever we're requesting data from a service, the schema is really just a description of the types and fields inside your service, like what's possible. So I like to think of it as a dictionary for your GraphQL service. So as is written here, GraphQL really is just a query language. Is really about selecting fields on different objects. I will go back up here and reiterate on the fields that we have in different objects. In our country object, we have the name and capital fields. And like I mentioned, GraphQL really is just a query language for selecting different fields in objects. And yeah, so the most basic component of a GraphQL schema are object types, and these represent the kind of object that you fetch and what fields it has in it. And your schema sort of defines all the objects in your service and the types in it. This is a really good example of a schema, or a very short schema definition, where we have a query object and a country object, and then the fields in each object are displayed here. Yeah, and here is another description of a very short schema. So building on the schema and how the schema describes our service, that being the objects in our service and the fields that our objects have. Every GraphQL service also has query types and may or may not have mutation types. So query and mutation are new words here. I like to think of queries as a way to read data from your service. So you request data, you are checking what data exists in your service, and mutations are a way of changing. I think the word mutation means to change or edit or mutate, really. And so queries, I like to describe them as a way to read data from a service. We have a query form, we have a sample query here. As we go on and start to use other operations in GraphQL, you start to notice that this is the format to access data in your services. So we have a query here, and we're we want to access data from our location. And what fields do we want? We want the name and the capital field. And then here we have more fields, and we can define what fields you want to get. So we want to get the language and the origin of a certain language. And this is sort of the query format that would make to a GraphQL service. And yeah, this is sort of the format that we follow when making queries. I think you notice these curly brackets and the very JSON looking like format of everything. And yeah, that's really it with queries. Mutations are very, like I mentioned, it's a way to change data from your GraphQL service or update data. So it's really sending data to your GraphQL service, unlike queries where you're fetching data from your GraphQL service. Mutations follow this format and come in a lot of shapes. So this mutation is a mutation to add a location to your service. So when we query a service, we might only have a couple of certain number of data inside it. So if we want to add more data to our service, we can use this mutation. And this would mean we're adding a new entry into our data store, and we'll be adding a name. Name is the field that is in the location object, and capital is another field in the location object. And this is the actual data that we'll be adding. So we want to add France as a name and Paris as a capital into our data store. And this is the format we'd use to make mutations. And really, this is just insight into what operations are possible. I'll go much deeper and give actual practical examples of how the mutations and queries work on an actual API that we'll create. And yeah, let me just go over everything that I was talking about in GraphQL types and operations. So I really like to start from here. I think this is a very good description of GraphQL and its type system. So GraphQL is a query language. So the GraphQL query language is basically about selecting fields on objects. So we have a description of objects that are typed So we have a query object that has a field location that returns the country object. And then we also have another object, a country object, of course, with the ID fields, name fields, and capital fields. And this schema just describes what's possible in your service. Sorry. And yeah, we can perform a few operations, these being queries and mutations in our GraphQL, on our GraphQL service. And now we'll sort of um, take a tiny tangent or branch out before we can actually create and start messing around with GraphQL APIs. So we're going to use Strapi to do this. I will be switching screens very soon, just so I can give you a description of what Strapi is. And
I think we have some connection problems at Daniel's side, so we'll just hold on for a minute or so. Um,
about that, but I like the something silly just happened. Um, hey, can you hear me?
yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think I was having like maintenance work and it was like a surge of power, so my power just left. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worry, no worry.
Yeah, but ready to go when you are. Oh, I'm supposed to share my screen, am I? Let me do
Yeah,
that. Okay,
yeah,
great.
ready.
All right. Let me just continue. All right. That's luckily we were going into our next section when we were interrupted, so I can just start from scratch.
Sure.
Um, we have we've described what GraphQL is and why it came about, how we use it, and where it's being used currently. We've talked about what a GraphQL schema is and how GraphQL really is just picking fields from different objects. And we've also gone through what a schema is and the different operations we can run on a GraphQL server service API. I'll use those interchangeably. And now we'll get into setting up a GraphQL API with Strapi. Strapi is a headless CMS. Um, so it is a content management system that it has an external API that can deliver data to a bunch of different front ends. And that is exactly what we'll be using to set up a GraphQL API today. So to get started with Strapi, what you have to do is run this command, and this starts up a Strapi instance with a MySQL database. And I will be going to, I'll be showing my terminal actually. Yep, this is the Strapi terminal. So getting a bunch of 405s. I'll just stop everything, um, and change directories into Graphql. I'm really sorry if you can't see this. I'll start our server. Um, cool. So I'll hide this again so that we're back here, and we'll just wait for our server to start, and then we will start with registering a user so that we can start to create data in Strapi. So what I want to do with our GraphQL API is make it mimic this schema that we were using as an example. So we have a schema that sort of defines a location. It has a location as a field, and inside that location, we have ID, name, and capital. So we'll try to create exactly just that with our Strapi GraphQL API. There we go. So Strapi starts up. The server has started. I'll just go back here so that we can talk about the structure of our data and the data we want to get back. So we want a locations object, a locations field, sorry, and we want that to, of course, return country, and country as an object should have the ID, name, and capital. Cool. So we'll go to Strapi and sort of create um, a new user and register a new user. Cool. This is sort of the interface. And in doing that, we will create a collection type. So, like I said, we want to have a locations. A collection type is a collection of different fields. And like in our GraphQL schema that we were looking at, it gives us an idea of what fields we want. So we know we want an ID and we want the name and we want capital. And all this is accessible through a location field. So we'll call our collection type location because it stores all these fields via the country object. So we will name this collection type location in Strapi and save that. So now we can select fields for our collection type. So by default, everything in our collection type will have an ID. So we don't have to create an ID. We do, however, have to create the name. So this is a text field. We'll keep this short text. We'll keep it lowercase. Then we'll add another field for our capital. And we'll keep this also as a yeah, lowercase, and then we'll finish, and that's it. We've built our, so it's sort of similar to the way our schema looks. We have location, and in location we have the name and capital. So we'll save this and wait for our server to restart. This should take just a minute. I'll take that to sip some coffee. Okay, I'll just restart the server manually. Great. So let's just go back and check in with what we're supposed to be doing in Strapi. So we're setting up a GraphQL API with Strapi, and we have created a Strapi app that has happened. We've created our first content model. Um, this content model being the collection type that we made called locations, and inside locations we added a capital and a name. And yeah, our server is back up and running. So great. Now we can add data to um, our locations just so that we can have something to query. So I'll add a new location. If you have like a preference for anything you want me to add, please put it in the con. Oh, okay. I'm looking at Hashel's questions. So collections are sort of an abstraction of tables in SQL. Because Strapi does support multiple databases, we don't really make that connection to just SQL specifically. We abstract it and look at collections as a group of fields that we define. So Strapi supports things like MariaDB, MongoDB, Postgres, and MySQL also. So it's yeah, it's not really it's well, I guess you could say that for each collection you would create a new table, but I wouldn't want to make that relation. But yeah, let's add some data. If you have like a name of a country and the capital that you want us to add, do add it in the comments. I'm in Zambia, and I'm Zambian, so I'll add Zambia as a country name and Lusaka as the capital. So I'll save that, and yep, there we go. I'll just add one more. Let's see, what countries do I know of? I know Australia. Australia. That's how it's spelled. Australia. Okay. I know the capital city is not Sydney, but I will put Sydney just so that we can change it later on. Great. Um, so this is Strapi. We created a location collection type, and we have some entries in our collection. So now what we need to do is enable GraphQL support. So there's two ways of doing this. You can either download GraphQL here, or you can enable it using the command line interface. So I would do this using the command line. I'll just get back the terminal and stop the server and use the command yarn strappy install GraphQL. And while that's installing, just go back to our Notion and check with the progress we've made. Great, okay. So I'll just add like a check mark. I like the green one. We created a content model, and we've also just added some data to our content model. Sorry, excuse me. And then we have added our GraphQL plugin. So let's add a check to that also. There we go. It's still installing dependencies, and so while it's installing, we'll just deal with permissions. So permissions are also a very nice way of limiting who does what inside, like to your endpoint, your API rather. So let's just go back to our marketplace. Oh, we won't be able to do this because the server is still down. So yeah, let's just wait. And I don't know if anyone has questions. Yeah. Yes, Harshal, we do support quite a number of DBs, which is pretty cool. Uh, so just so that we can, oh yeah, an error occurred because the server is still down. So don't worry about this. Let's just go back here while everything is installing. Yeah, so we do support multiple DBs, and just so that I can show you what we went with. So when we were creating the Strapi app using this command, yarn create Strapi app GraphQL 101, we used the quick start um, a quick start flag here, which means that we set up a MySQL DB because it won't need any configuration for database ports or server addresses like Postgres or the things like MongoDB would need. So that was why we use Quick Start. So it's a nice way just to get up and running with Strapi, creating content models really quick. Yeah. All right. Looks like our GraphQL plugin is almost done. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Now would be a really good time to ask them. Oh, what is the default one? So when you're setting up Strapi, if you don't use the quick start flag, you get to choose like your own. So there really isn't a default. Like it's up to you and what you want to use when setting it up. I can sort of say like the uh, SQLite with the quick start option is the default because yeah, there'll be like no extra setup from you. Yeah. Um, let's check our progress. All right, it's installed and it's just rebuilding the admin UI. So we're making progress. So this is something that I was talking to Jonathan about. Jonathan is the creator of Chakra UI. He was complaining about how, as developers, we spend a lot of our time looking at loading screens, waiting for things to install or build or deploy, and probably in a few years would have spent probably months or a day's worth of time just looking at things, waiting to build. So cool. Yeah, um, makes a bit of sense. All right, let's see if we can do a quick recap and just go over what we've done. So we are, oh, I forgot to add the check here. We, of course, created a Strapi app. That's exactly what we're using. Check. We created a content model. That's done. We've added data to our content model, of course, and we are currently adding our GraphQL plugin so we can actually use GraphQL with Strapi. And that's exactly what is installing at the moment. That's our um, waiting for, yeah, this shouldn't take more than a minute now. Looks like it's almost done. All right. Um, also, just to leave this out there, if you want to follow through what I'm looking at the moment, this is a Notion page, and if you want access to that Notion page, everything is on this link. I don't know if you could put that for everyone to look at on the screen. Yeah, that's the link to the resources for today's workshop. Okay, so while this is building, because immediately after finishing up with permissions, we will jump into understanding GraphQL tooling. Um, so in the GraphQL ecosystem, there's a certain, sorry, there are certain tools that are used to um, sort of make developing with GraphQL much easier. And like I mentioned, like this is really just the workshop that I wish I got when I was getting started with GraphQL. So something that I wish I wish I knew was what happens behind or in the background of a GraphQL request. So like I mentioned, we can run a couple of operations on a GraphQL API. So either queries or mutations. And if you looked at our query format, I would just go back to where we were talking about our query format. This is a query format. It resembles um, JSON really. And what a GraphQL request really is a post request over HTTP where we send a JSON body to a GraphQL server. And that sort of tells the GraphQL server that this is what this client is requesting. And the JSON body has either a query or mutation written, which is really just our operation name and has the description of the exact fields we want. And then the server just responds with that exact data that you requested for. So I think that's something really nice to know at the back of everything. Once you get into using GraphQL, GraphQL requests really are just post requests over HTTP with a JSON body. So that's nice to know. All right, it looks like our server is up and running now. So we can go back to our Strapi console and refresh. I think this is, I can make things a bit bigger. Sorry for the small content. So just to reiterate for context, what happened, we created a content type called location, and we had two fields inside it, name and capital, so that we can have the name of a country and the capital of the country returned to us when we request this data. And then we added some records to our collection type. So we added Zambia and Australia as countries. And then we have now successfully added our GraphQL plugin so we can actually use GraphQL. But before we can do any of that, we have to set permissions so that people, like we are able to query our own GraphQL API. So in the public role, we just go to our collection type here, location, and we enable find and find one. So this will enable us to query our API and get data from Strapi. We have a few other fields that that we can use, and we will update these later. So we can either update, sorry, delete, and create records via our API. And for now, we'll just leave find and find one, so we can query some data. Great. So we've go back to setting up Strapi just so that we can paint a picture of what we have done. We have just set our permissions so that we can actually query these fields. So that's it with getting GraphQL, setting up the API, a GraphQL API with Strapi. We created a Strapi app. We created a content model. We added data to the content model, and we added our GraphQL plugin, and we've set our permissions. So that's it. Now we can actually play around with GraphQL and start making queries. Before that, I really just want to give us context on what goes on in the tooling space in GraphQL. We'll be using a tool called a GraphQL Playground, which is built into Strapi's implementation of GraphQL. So the GraphQL Playground is sort of a graphical interface which is interactive in nature. It's like an in-browser GraphQL IDE that was built by Prisma. So yeah, it comes with basic features like syntax highlighting, intelligent types ahead of fields, real-time error highlighting, reporting for queries and variables, and documentation explorer, and has markdown support. So this is based on something called Graphql. The Graphql Playground is based on something called Graphql, which is sort of the official integrated development environment for GraphQL. It helps us explore GraphQL APIs interactively and helps us construct queries. And yeah, that's sort of context into what we'll be using. And yeah, let's go and play around in our playground. So by default, Strapi is always running on localhost um, 1338. So localhost 1338. And if we want to access our GraphQL Playground, that is at so localhost 1337 slash GraphQL. Sorry, I think I said 1338. It's 1337. Great. So we want to now make some queries. So we've got some context on what goes behind the GraphQL request, and we've understood what a GraphQL Playground is. It's a in-browser interactive IDE for GraphQL, IDE being Integrated Development Environment. So now we want to make queries. Um, so remember what a query is. A query really is just fetching data from our GraphQL API. So we can make queries, two different types of queries. We can make very specific queries where we want to get a very specific resource. Um, so we'll build that out from scratch in our Graphql. I'll just delete everything and zoom in a little. Let me just make sure that this is visible to everyone. Okay, so I see a few questions. So what libraries can help us with using GraphQL on the front end? So I'll be getting a bit into that after we've done queries. So I'll be answering that a bit later. And so Fennel is asking about authentication. So I'll explain that also after we've made our queries and mutations. Really good questions. Okay, so I'll just delete everything that's in here and start building a query from scratch. And how do I get rid of all this also? Just a new tab. Okay, great. So we're building a query. Remember, we want to access location. We're doing a very specific query here. So I remember I mentioned there are two types of queries. We can make a specific query for a specific resource, or we can make a general query for all the resources in an endpoint. So before we make a specific query, I just want to make a general query. So we access our locations object, and inside that we can define exactly what we want. So we can get our ID. And remember, this is the GraphQL Playground we're currently in, the in-browser IDE for GraphQL. It has IntelliSense, and that's why you see things popping up here, which is very useful. So besides our ID, we want to get our name, and we want to get our capital. So before I actually run this, I want to go to Strapi and show you what we have currently in our data store. We have Australia and Zambia as locations. So we should be able to get exactly just that back when we run this query in our GraphQL Playground. And we do get just that. So we get ID, name, and capital for Zambia and Australia. And this is how you sort of run a general query. Um, we can make a specific query by changing this to singular. So locations is plural, which means we're getting everything in our data store, every record in our data store. If we make it singular and define an ID, So if we say ID, and in our previous query, we saw that Australia had an ID of 2. So we can add that as a parameter in our query. So running this query now should only give us Australia's details. And that's exactly what happens. So that's like a glimpse of the two types of queries you can make. You can make a general query or a specific query where you add a parameter. In this case, that's being our ID. If we change the ID to 1, this would give us Zambia's data, and it gives us exactly just that. Um, so yeah, those are the two types of queries we can make. We can make very specific queries, or we can make general queries where we sort of get all the entries in our data store. And that's it with making queries. Um, I think before we move on to mutations, I really want to reiterate on how GraphQL is really just picking fields that you want. So if we don't want to get the capital, we can completely omit that, and we can omit the ID if we don't want to receive that in our response. So we can let's make a very general query to the API, and we get exactly what we ask for. So look at the format of this. We just want the name, and that's exactly what we get back. We can take the name out and get only the capital of the data in our data store, and that's exactly what we get back. So that's pretty cool. It's really get exactly what you request for, and that's building and sending queries with GraphQL. Great. So now we can make mutations. So remember, mutations are us building mutations are us mutating data, changing data, or adding data to a GraphQL API. So we have a couple of different types of mutations. So I don't call this adding. So I'll say create. So we can create data from scratch with mutations, and this is the mutation format. So what we want, so we have mutation names also. That is quite something we have to pay attention to. There's a format that mutations have. So if we copy this mutation and paste that in our GraphQL Playground, what this is saying is we're using the create location object, which really just runs a mutation. And then we have a few inputs. And this is where we add the data that we want to add. So we want to add a new entry whose name is Egypt and whose capital is Cairo. And if we run this, it says forbidden. And I did this on purpose. Why? Because if we want to change data on our APIs, we have to give ourselves permission to do that. So remember, when we're giving ourselves permission in Strapi, we only gave ourselves permission to find one and find general data from locations. So we didn't give ourselves permission to create data, which is exactly what this query was doing. We're creating a new entry, so we didn't give ourselves permission to do that. So we'll give ourselves permission to create data, to delete data, and to update data in our GraphQL API, and we'll save that. And if we run the query again, everything should work fine. So if we run this mutation, everything should work fine. And then we have something new added here, and it gives us just that back. And just so that you can like you can see that that's actually been added, we'll actually do a query to get everything, the ID, the name, oops, the name and the capital. So if we run this, previously we just had Zambia and Australia. Now we should have Egypt. which we just added with our mutation. So if, I don't know, does anyone want any other country added? Let's see. What other countries do I know of? Um, what countries are easy to spell? Let's see. We have Nigeria. The capital of Nigeria is Lagos. And if we run this, yeah, we get confirmation that that has been added. And if we go back and run our query to see what data our API has, we have Zambia, we have Australia, we have Egypt, and we have Nigeria. So that is great. That's us going through creating data, adding data with a mutation. So besides adding data, we can also update data. So let's just copy this um, format and come and paste this in our GraphQL Playground. So remember when we just run this query again, when we added Australia to our data, I purposely made the capital Sydney, which is wrong. So we want to update this. Oh yeah, we can do Singapore, no problem. Um, where is that? So create location. Singapore is sort of both like a country and a city, so its capital is itself. Um, Singapore, okay. Also, if this is wrong, please tell me. We'll update it with a mutation. um, yeah, okay. So we ran our query, and Australia was wrong. The capital of Australia is not Sydney; it's Canberra. So we want to update this with a mutation. So again, if we look at um, the object here, it's update location, and before it was create location. So create location creates a new location, and we add that data into our data store. But it's different with update location. We want to update, and this is sort of the syntax. So once we do that, we of course add our input, and then we need to define where we want to update um, where we want to update our data. So we can either use an ID. ID is the best pick here because it's a unique identifier. So we just need to get the ID of Australia. We run our query, ID of Australia is 2, right? So we change this ID to 2 so it knows that the entry whose ID is 2 is where we change data. So Australia is the name and the capital is Canberra, and we run this mutation and we get this back, which means it was successful. And if we go back and run our query again, this is a query to get the ID name and capital. Australia now is updated to Canberra, right? Great. So let's add another location just so we can delete it. Um, what name can we give this? Um, I don't know. Is Antarctica a country? Antarctica. I don't think that's how you spell it. But let's just go with it. Um, um, iceberg. This is very wrong, but it's fine. We'll delete it. So iceberg is the capital of Antarctica. So that's been added. We check our query, and Antarctica is present. So similarly, we just went over how we can use mutations to create data. We can use mutations to update data, and we can use mutations to delete data. So we'll copy this, and we'll go back to our playground, and this is getting a bit cumbersome. I'll close a few tabs. Cool. So this is our query. Sorry, our mutation. Again, remember the object here is delete location. So we'll be deleting a location. And of course, we have to enter an input and define some parameters for which exact entry we want to delete. So we want to delete Antarctica, but we have to find out what um, what the ID of Antarctica is. So let's make a query to our API, ID and name, yeah, ID and name. Oh, locations, plural. Yeah, thank you. So you see when you make mistakes, it tells you and it gives you very good error messages. So let's just make that mistake again. So it says field location requires an argument ID of type ID is required but was not provided. So you can see that when you want to make a specific query, you use the singular name of your field. And if you use the singular, of course, you have to add an ID to specify which exact entry you're looking for. And it tells us just that. So we want a general query. So we want to get every entry. So we use locations, which is the plural. And when we run that, we get everything back. So we wanted to delete Antarctica, which is ID 6. So we go back to our delete query and we want to delete number 6. So poof, it gives us back exactly what we deleted. And if we run our query again, um, yeah, Antarctica is gone. And this is sort of yeah, not really sort of. This is exactly how you delete data with mutations. So we've just gone over the different types of mutations we can carry out, where we can create data, we can update data, we can delete data, and all these, all this is in the resource that I mentioned at the beginning of the workshop. It's a Notion page, and you can find all this data. So yeah, that's it. Let's just do a quick recap. We've gone through what GraphQL is. We've gone through types and operations. We've gone through setting up a GraphQL API with Strapi. We've gone through understanding some toolings. We talked about what's behind a GraphQL request, and we talked about the playground and Graphql, and we talked about making queries in our playground and making mutations in our playground. So now, to answer the question, someone asked about the libraries that can help us with using GraphQL on the front end. That's what we'll get into. That's what we'll get into doing. Yes. So that's a very good question. Yep. There's a lot of ways of requesting data on your front end and getting GraphQL to work. So I'll answer the question and then I'll go in detail as we are actually adding GraphQL to our web app. So like I mentioned, behind the GraphQL query is just a post request. So when we send a post request with a JSON payload, um, yeah, we can use something like fetch or Axios to make such a post request and like embed the JSON as a payload and get back our query result. However, not really however, there is a lot that goes into making GraphQL work really well and at scale. So a lot of people like to use Apollo, the Apollo client, which is really popular, and most people would assume. I know I thought when I started out that Apollo was the only way to use a GraphQL API in the front end of the application. But yeah, so anything, as long as you send a post request with a library like Fetch or Axios or any other library that can make HTTP requests for JavaScript, that's very JavaScript specific. And yeah, that's really how you can get your yeah, that's how you can make your GraphQL API work in a front end of an application. So that's a very short answer, but I'll get a lot deeper as I'm actually explaining how to make our GraphQL API work with our Vue.js application. Great. So if you have not used Vue.js before, this is a good time to install the Vue CLI using this command. I already have the Vue CLI installed, so I would just I'll pop up a, where is that? Which one is that? Great, I'll pop up a terminal here, and let me just take this aside. Great, here we go. So I have a terminal window open where I have a Vue application working. I would just run yarn serve. Let's run yarn serve for to start the server, and I'll take this side. So to get started, just install the Vue CLI, and after installing the Vue CLI, create a new Vue project using this command. We can name our project Hello GraphQL, and then once you have the Vue CLI installed and a new Vue project set up, um, we can now add GraphQL support. So I'll just wait for my Vue server to come up so that I can actually show people how, okay, yeah, so I can actually show people how the application will look. So let's just wait some time for this to finish. Oh, it's 12%. Okay, wait for that. So once your application is built and your server is up and running, you can install Vue Apollo. So Vue, like I mentioned, a lot of people find Apollo client a really robust, easy, and good developer experience when using GraphQL with web apps. So that's what we'll be using in this instance. So to add Apollo client to your application, just run vue add Apollo in your project folder, and it will do all the necessary setup to get a Vue working with a GraphQL endpoint. I'll also open VS Code just so that we can do some development. Uh, I have to open that from scratch. Anyway, at least you know this is live. Uh, that should open, and yeah. So what is Apollo? Apollo client rather. Because Apollo is pretty huge. So Apollo client is a JavaScript library that helps us manage local and remote data with GraphQL. So we can use it to fetch, cache, and modify application data, all while automatically updating the UI. So a huge problem, I guess, and a reason why a lot of people like to use Apollo client is um, the stuff it does in the background, the related tooling it does, being able to cache your data and modify it, as well as update your UI while you are accessing your GraphQL API. And we'll have a look at what that looks like. So we have our app running. I'll just go to localhost 8080 so I can give you a feel of what that looks like. Yeah, so this is your Vue.js application. This is like the typical Vue.js application you get when you just start using Vue. Okay, I will just open up the Vue.js application so you can make the changes that are necessary in VS Code. Okay, yeah, I guess this is a good time as any to ask questions. Oh, yeah, let me get to the authentication question. So how does authentication work with GraphQL? So it's just like a typical REST endpoint. So you would want to limit your certain parts of your application to people who are authenticated. And a really popular way of authenticating users is using JWTs, JWTs. So in your requests in Strapi, you can do that also. You can authenticate users and pass a JWT token that you can send with your GraphQL requests so that if that validation happens and um, your JWT token is valid, you get access to the data that you requested. And if it's not, you don't. So that's a really quick answer to how authentication works in yeah in GraphQL. I'm just opening up the application in VS Code. Okay, this is hello GraphQL. Great. So let's just recap. So at this point, you should have installed the Vue CLI with this command. You should have created a new Vue project and had this page come up. And then you can run this command now to install Vue Apollo, which will help us access our Vue, our GraphQL API. So Vue add Apollo, and in the meantime, you can also run yarn add GraphQL tag. So I will run this actually because I haven't run this yet. So GraphQL tag helps us structure our GraphQL. Um, Let me just run that. Yeah, yarn add GraphQL tag. GraphQL tag helps us use a certain format. It helps us use the GQL and um, paste our queries in between these certain tags. I forgot what they are called. It's like the slanted commas. Let me just pull up VS Code. Wow, this is running so that we can actually have a look at the code. Great. I'll zoom in. Okay, so once you've added Vue Apollo, once you run Vue add Apollo, we'll get an Apollo config file. Cool. So this just sets up a bunch of things for us. We'll go to our source and I'll allow that to happen. Yeah, so view apollo.js. This is where we want to add our endpoint. So we can ignore all this config. We don't need this. This is for other operations. What we want to do here is change this endpoint so that it reflects our Strapi endpoint. So Strapi's GraphQL, like I said, is available at 1337. So let me zoom in. Yes, I think this should look good. Yeah, that looks good. Okay. So yeah, Strapi's GraphQL endpoint is available at 1337, localhost 1337/GraphQL, and that's all we need to do. We just need to add our endpoint here. Then let's go to our app.vue file. I'll just give you a brief description of what the app.vue file is. So this is where we edit our web page. So we have an image of the Vue.js logo. We'll keep that. However, we will do away with Hello World. And let's see what happens. Let's change this. Use an h2 tag. So something silly is about to happen. I hope not. Cool. And just take away this component because we're not using it anymore. We will not be using any components, so that's fine. And we'll save our work and restart our server. Yeah, so something silly. Let's put everything in lowercase because no cap. Okay. Yep, let me just save this. Okay, let's just wait for our app to finish building. La la la. Let's see if there's any questions. Not yet. Okay, there we go. Our app is done. So I will save this. Then let's go back to, where is that? Oh, wrong page. GraphQL 101, yes. So we have installed GraphQL Tag at this point. And we'll go and refresh. I should say something silly is about to happen. Perfect. All right, so let's just do a quick recap of what we've done. We created our Vue app. We ran this command. We created a new Vue project. That is exactly what we are seeing here. We installed Vue Apollo, which is how we were able to add our strappy GraphQL endpoint to the endpoint constant. And this is an explanation of Apollo client because we installed Apollo client and we also installed GraphQL tag. So now this is me answering the question of using GraphQL in the front end of our application. So yes, we have our template, which is the HTML portion of our Vue application, and script tag is where we add any JavaScript and related logic. So inside our script tag, we need to import GraphQL tag one. Um, so we'll go to our app.vue file and import GraphQL tag. We've installed it. And before we save, we should just finish up. So remember, we have locations in the query we made here. We just want to make a query, same query as this, so that we get exactly this data back. But we also want to get the capital. So I'll just run this inside the playground. So the playground really just gives you an idea of what data you'll be getting back in your application when you actually do make a query in your application. So yeah, this is our query, and we can literally just copy it and paste it in our Vue app. So this is the format we'll be using. We define Apollo and then set locations, which is what we'll be getting back. And then this GQL is what we're importing from GraphQL tag, because then it lets us add our query in the code like that. So let's just do exactly that. Apollo, then locations. Let me just make sure this is visible to everybody. Okay, yeah, that looks big enough. Locations, and then GQL, okay, and then oh my bad, this was supposed to be like that. The scope of this thing. Okay. Nope, that's wrong. Let's just start over. All right. I turned off my syntax highlighting. How are we defining this? Are we defining this as JSON? Okay, that's why. Okay, yep, that's working. So, yeah, now if we save this and go to our application, we won't have anything displaying, of course, because we we haven't set it up to make that happen. But I just want to check our dev tools here. So I'll pull up, inspect the dev tools, and I'll go to the network tag and I will um, refresh. So you can see we're getting cause errors. Okay, so I'm not sure if I can zoom this in. Uh-huh. So we made a request to localhost, not 400. I'll just close this again. Okay, it seems to be making a, so I need to change the, um, this. Did we save this? We did not save this. It's okay. So now we saved that, and if we go back, we see that we're actually making a request to, yeah, localhost 1337 now. So you can see the method is a post. So we're of course making a GraphQL request. And if we click here and check the request we set, so we're sending, of course, this JSON payload as a query, and our response is the data that would be similar to the data in our playground. So we've added Apollo, we've got our queries working, we've got our requests working. All that we need to do now is display the information on the web page. So let's go back and just do a quick recap. So we've defined our query, that's happening, and all we need to do now is display some results. So let's just copy this template, and I will explain it, and go back to our app.view. So something silly is about to happen. So let's just paste that right under this. Um, what is ESLint saying? Mixed spaces and okay, let's just leave it. All right. So yeah, we have the locations type here defined, which is exactly the locations here. So what we're doing here is using the v-for directive. This is a special Vue keyword that sort of passes and iterates over data in an array. So the data we're getting back is in an array. Our response is an array because there's a couple number of items. And we're looping through each item. And for each item, we're displaying the location name. So when we save this, we should be able to see the, the name of every country in our entry. And if we save this and travel back, there we go. So we are seeing Zambia, Australia, Egypt, Nigeria, Singapore. And that's sort of how you add, that is exactly how you add GraphQL to the front end of your web application. So we can also make mutations. So I just want to add a mutation and add another country. So we have, let's create location. We want to create a new location. Does anyone have a country that they would want added here? Please add it to the comments so that we can add it to our API. I mean our web page. What country is? Let's add India. I was scared to add India because um, I always fumble the spelling of New Delhi. Um, Delhi, Delhi. Is this right? Please let me know if this is like the right spelling. Anyway, we'll add India, and we get that back. So we just added a mutation. And if we go to our web page and refresh this, we should see New Delhi. We should see India, sorry, at the bottom of our list. There we go. Um, so yeah, like Hashil says, that seemed really easy. Yeah, it's I like to think it's easy. Um, yeah, let's add more details to our let's add more details here. So we could probably add a let's make it much smaller. And so this is a special view way of interpolating data. Location dot capital, um, and then outside this we can say capital city is that. If we save our work and go back, that should reflect in our. Oh, something happened. No matching end tag. My bad. I think I was too excited about having that work. Yeah, I can see the capital cities. All right, here we go. Refresh, or really it will rebuild. So Zambia, capital city Lusaka, Australia, capital city Canberra, Egypt, capital city Cairo, Nigeria, Lagos, Singapore, India, New Delhi. So that's pretty much it. This is how we use GraphQL in a web app. So we set up a Vue.js application. We added GraphQL support. Um, we defined a query, application. We can change this query. If we change this query, it will change how, like, what data we. Yeah, I thought so. Delhi, the H and the L always, always mess with me. So yeah, let's run a mutation to change that. So right now you can see Delhi is spelled very wrong. Um, let's go to um, our update. First of all, let's get the ID of India. So ID is 7. So we want to update an item where the ID is 7. The name is India and the capital is New Delhi, exactly with the L first. So we run that and it's changed. Let's go back. This is the wrong spelling with the H first. We refresh and um, yeah, there we go with the L first. So that's GraphQL and web applications. Just so everything's visible, let me take this out. So we have this image tag. Take that out and everything should appear. There we go. Something silly is about to happen. Zambia, Australia, Egypt, Nigeria, Singapore, and India. Um, yeah, this was fun, and that's adding um, GraphQL in a web application. So I've linked resources here if you want any. There's a bunch of resources on learning more about GraphQL with Strapi. I have a link to that here. I have a link to full stack GraphQL, a link to another full stack GraphQL tutorial from the folks at Hasura. GraphQL.org has a really good learning resource also. Eve has an amazing book on learning GraphQL and the repository. And I've added a few GraphQL projects of mine in case anyone wants to get some inspiration or have an idea of how GraphQL can be used in applications with different operations. I have a podcast also, and I've added a link to the GraphQL documentary by Honeypot. And um, I don't know how good we're doing on time, Devansh. I want to take a few questions and also just talk about some ideas um, for things that you can make with GraphQL. Um, so like this being a
Uh,
hackathon. Yeah, what's
am
up?
I
Hi.
am I audible? Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, exactly. We were like while we were discussing before the session, right? So this was a really good workshop, by the way. Like this was something which is, which can be helpful for someone who's starting out from scratch, right?
Yeah.
So this was a really good session, and we were discussing that what are the ideas, like what someone can make using GraphQL or Strapi. If you would like to tell us.
Yeah, sure. I feel like the limit is your silliness and your creativity. um, so you can make really anything that needs data. Sorry.
Right.
So I see people making a lot of games with Strapi and GraphQL, both like web games and VR. There are a bunch of really interesting use cases to use that. Um, I see people making like full, not really like data intensive applications, because one thing you can do with Strapi is add authentication, like for users. I think someone was asking about how authentication works. Yeah, Feno was asking about how
Yeah.
authentication works. You can do that also if you want to create like a what do people make? Like a to-do app. To-do is like the yeah, what everyone thinks of, or a
Mhm.
job board. Um, People can make like um, note-taking applications, which is practically a to-do app. Um, I really
I
think the
have a
limit is
quick
like your
question.
creativity. Yeah,
Can someone make a real-time game?
a real-time game. So out of the box, you'd have to use something else like um, what is this? What is that tool called? Something like Apply or Socket.io.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but yeah, it is possible if you want to store your data in Strapi and have that real-time connection with like a third-party service. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, you could make games. I was thinking of making like a space explorer game, and I'm currently making like a job board with yeah, with Strapi.
Exactly. Like we had a workshop yesterday, like just yesterday about WebSockets. So yeah,
Oh, so that's an amazing use case. So yes, exactly. You can implement like WebSockets and tinker around with some really cool things. But yeah,
yes,
I think the limit is your imagination, I guess.
right, right, right. So as you were talking about like before the session that people are coming up with like unimaginary stuff. It's Travi, right? So we were talking with Herschel about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
Like I've seen people make like fitness apps.
mm,
So you can like integrate with a bunch of other APIs and have like an app where you can track your fitness and your diet and food. Like people have made like VR games and like web games. I've seen someone make like an AR game that you can with Unity, where you use Strapi as like a data source, and you learn to play the piano virtually. That was really cool.
like that is really good.
So
Like that
yeah,
sounds fascinating, right?
it is super fascinating. Um, yeah, and like there's mobile games. There's like these quiz type games that people make also. I see a lot of people using Strapi for that. Or
Yeah,
what are these things? I've seen someone make a football. I don't know what you can call them. So like a lot of these sports websites that display like scores and updates and stuff like that.
yeah.
I've seen someone make something like that with Strapi also. That was really nice because that's like a lot of data. So you have like all the
Mhm.
matches in a current match day, the player names, the scores, the number of goals.
Yeah,
So it can handle a lot of data intensive applications like that also.
that's really cool. Like what, like exactly what as you said that imagination is the limit.
Yeah, pretty much. But yeah, like you saw, pretty standard setting up collection types, like a collection of fields that you'd want to store data with.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's like Hershey who said that. Hershey was like, yeah, awesome. That seemed really easy. I hope it was.
Yeah, you make it seem really easy. Not like I'm someone who hasn't really worked on Gatsby, and I could really understand like on GraphQL. I'm sorry. So like I haven't really worked, but it's really helpful for beginners. Even I could understand some stuff. Like I was going through the session also. It is really
Oh,
fun.
I'm glad. Thank you for that feedback. Um, that means I was sort of successful.
No, you are completely successful.
Yeah. But yeah, like this is open for anyone. These resources will not leave if anyone wants to look back at them or share
Yeah.
them with anyone. Yeah, this is there for
We'll
anyone who
we'll
wants
make
to.
sure that like we'll share it to the Discord channel we have, right? So like everyone will be able to see if they
Oh,
are
that's
if
great.
they, so if they want to get started with GraphQL, so they can.
Awesome. Yeah.
Okay,
Happy
so
to happy to help also if
anyone,
anyone wants wants like direction.
yeah. So yeah. Okay, so if is there anything last sentences you want to say about Silly Hacks or GraphQL or someone who's getting started with Silly Hacks or hackathons in general?
Uh, Hackathons are an amazing way to um, also like I'd commend the Silly Hacks team for putting this together. It's really amazing.
Thank you.
Besides just giving people the platform to work on things that they want to work on or solve problems they see around or just tinker around with programming languages and explore different concepts. I think it's really nice that you've put together all these resources in the form of workshops for people to actually look at what they might want to build with during those hackathons. So, like, amazing job. And like to anyone who's new to hackathons, like once you go hackathons, you never go back.
That's true.
I've done it. I've done a few hackathons myself with some of the people on the team. We ran hackathons and we've been to hackathons and they're still doing hackathons. Like hackathons never stop. It's a way of life. So
Yeah.
welcome to hackathon culture and good luck with your hacks.
Sure. Thank you. And it was great to have you and thank you for being with us on a weekend. I know we know that you had a long weekend, so now we'll let you rest.
Yeah, I'll go catch up on some sleep now. But yeah, thanks for having me. I hope this was really informative for everyone.
Yeah, it was. It was. It was.
Awesome. All
All
right.
right. So today we had Daniel, and thank you everyone for yeah. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, it's fine. I'll mute myself now.
Okay, so thank you for being with us on a weekend, everyone. And if you want to stay tuned for such amazing workshops and sessions, so make sure that you have subscribed to Culture Studios channel. And if you want to get notifications for our live sessions, click on the notifications icon so you have that. All right. So and all the best for your hackathon. And if you haven't registered yet, the link will be down below. It will be tickering. And yeah, stay safe.